Hola mis estudiantes y bienvenidos a la semana 12 o la 12ª semana. Aquí estamos hablando de verbos irregulares con cambios en la raíz, ¿no? O verbos irregulares en la raíz. Es una categoría que siempre se habla, ¿no? Cuando se habla del presente, y es lo que vamos a estar hablando hoy. Es un poco diferente, ¿no? A lo que hemos hecho antes. Es tal vez lo más complejo, ¿no? Del presente, o que es más complejo, ¿no? Para los anglohablantes. Y entonces es lo que vamos a estar hablando hoy. Lo importante de verbos irregulares con cambios en la raíz es que tienes que primeramente hacer la bota. También tienes que recordar la pauta, es decir, el patrón, ¿no? Que cada verbo o cada categoría sigue. Es muy importante. Y además, por ahora, ¿no? Que están aprendiendo cómo hacerlo, lo importante también es recordar o memorizar todos los verbos que están adentro o que siguen, ¿no? El contexto de cada pauta, de cada patrón. Entonces, es muy importante, ¿no? Esas dos cosas. Tienes que recordar la forma en que los verbos cambian y además los verbos y cada categoría, ¿no? Que esos verbos siguen, ¿no? Ocupan, ¿no? Utilizan. Ok, ahora lo voy a explicar un poco en inglés porque pienso que los estudiantes lo entenderán mejor y vamos a ver cómo nos va. Ok. So today we're talking about stem changing verbs. I'm continuing on with my trend to try to talk a little bit in Spanish, right? So y'all can hear a little bit of Spanish before I explain it in English. So this week, in week 12, the important grammatical thing that we are talking about is stem changing verbs. Now, remember that when we were learning irregular yo verbs, one of the things that I said was that irregular yo verbs fit into a category where that is the pattern for those verbs. That is to say, those verbs are always irregular in the yo form. That is their pattern, and that is why they are called irregular yo verbs, because they are within the pattern. So when we're thinking about stem changing verbs, again, the category is the pattern. So when we're saying verbs are stem changing, what we mean is their pattern is to change in the stem before you can conjugate them. There's something important having to do with stem changing verbs that anytime you're learning these verbs, it's important to remember. Remember that the endings tell us what subject is doing the action or who is speaking and where we are in time. Since we are still in the present, the endings will not change. They will remain exactly the same. So you are still going to base that ending on the subject doing the action and where we are in time, right? That is to say, the present. So if we were to put over here all the potential endings, these endings are actually going to remain exactly the same as they have before. So we're still going to have these endings of verbs. It's very important to remember this because whenever students tend to do stem changers, they feel oftentimes like they're starting all over. But you're not starting all over because you have the endings already and you already know the endings. So all you're doing whenever we think about stem changers is you're adding an extra step. That's the part that can sometimes be a little confusing, right? We're just adding a little bit of an extra step before you add on the ending, right? But that extra step is going to follow a pattern, and that pattern is the stem changing pattern. Okay, so there are a couple of things that often people like to remember when it comes to stem changers. I feel like there are 3 important things to remember. I'll break them up into 3 rather than into 2 this time. There are a couple of things to remember, right? The first important thing to remember is the form in which verbs stem change. In this case, for stem changing verbs in the present, the form tends to be called the boot. I don't know why it's called the boot. That is just generally what we call it. So verbs generally tend to change in a formation that we call the boot. How does the boot work? Well, I'm going to show you. So let's say we have a verb, right? Let's take any verb. How about preferir? Okay? Here's the first question that I often get asked. How do I know, in a verb like this, what is the part that's going to stem change? I have an easy answer for you. We are always going to stem change the vowel closest to the infinitive. Here's the infinitive. This is the vowel closest to the infinitive. So that is the one that will always stem change. Like here, for example, this is the infinitive. This is the vowel closest to the infinitive. This is the infinitive. This is the vowel closest to the infinitive. This is the infinitive. This is the vowel closest to the infinitive. So always, whatever vowel it's going to be, it's always going to be the one closest to the infinitive, not farther away, right? So in this case, that's this vowel right here. Now, what happens when we have a verb, right? I wrote that verb there. What happens when we have a verb? We always like to say, right, we're going to take off the ER and write the root. All right, well, let's say I'm doing that. Sorry for my weird F's. The problem is that when we have a stem changer, we have a category that stem changer fits into. In this case, the E becomes IE. So, but only in the boot. Only in the boot. So the E, this E right here, right, the one closest to the infinitive, is going to be taken out. And what's it going to become? IE, right? So now I need IE, 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 IE. Okay? Then what happens? Then my verb just conjugates normally, right? I have an IR verb, so I need IR endings. So, prefiero, prefieres, prefiere, preferimos, preferís, prefieren, right? Because I stem change, but I only stem change what's in the boot. So all we're doing is we're saying we have to change the root a little bit before we can put the ending on, but only if it's in the boot. So for example, if I had the verb pensar, this is the E that's closest to the infinitive. So this would be pienso, piensas, piensa, pensamos, pensáis, piensan, right? Because this E would become bien, but only in the boot. Again, if I had the verb like cerrar, for example, or querer, if I had querer, right, it would be quiere, it ends in an ER, so quiero, quieres, quiere, but stem change. Queréis. No stem change. Quieren. See? Now these are the verbs right here, taken directly from your book, that follow this E to IE category. People often ask me, are there more? Of course there are more. These are just the ones that the book has chosen for y'all to learn. Okay, so the same goes, right, with the O to UE category. If I was to pick a verb, let's pick poder, right? Remember, right, to look in your book to learn what these verbs mean, as well as sometimes ones that are a little bit irregular, like tener en venir, a little bit irregular, decir, a little bit irregular, so you want to look those up. Okay, so in this pattern, if I take off my ER and I write my root, but what happens, right, inside the boot, what has to change before the verb is conjugated? The O has to become a UE. So in the boot, this O is taken out, and instead of an O, I put in a UE. Okay, so now I'm going to conjugate it using ER endings. Puedo, puedes, puede, podemos, podéis, pueden. See? That's exactly it in a nutshell. And again, the same, right? Over here, whenever we have the E to IE category, we'll just pick one, right? We could pick pedir. That's a common one. So we're going to take up the infinitive, right? And we write the root, but because they are stem changers, what has to happen? In the boot, this E has to become I. So it's an IR verb, so I'm going to conjugate based on IR endings. Pido, pides, pide, pedimos, pedis, piden. So again, going back to my original statement, the most important thing to remember about these verbs is the form in which they change, or the boot, the categories they can change to, whether it be E to IE, O to UE, or E to I, and what verbs fall within each category. Those are going to be the most important things to learn about these stem changing verbs, and everything else can come, but the most important thing, right, is to remember that. And also, don't forget, right, whatever the infinitive tells us, we're still going to follow that as a rule for the conjugation at the end, okay? So we assume that you already know that part and that we don't have to relearn that whenever we do stem changers, because we've already taught you that. Okay, let's try a couple and see how it goes. All right, so we have yo volver a casa. So we're going to take off the ER, and then we want to write the root down, but remember, yo is in the boot. So we have to change this O to a UE. So when we write our root down, we're going to write V-U-E-L-V. Okay? And then we're going to conjugate based on the ER, so vuelvo. Fernando, pensar del futuro. Fernando is an él, so we're going to take off our AR, and it's in the boot because it would be third person singular, So we're going to take off this E and we're going to add an IE. So we're going to write that in the root. P-I-E-N-S. Fernando is él, and it's an AR, so it's piensa. ¿Ok? Tú repetir todo lo que el profesor decir. Okay. So we're going to take off the IR and we're going to remember whichever one changes is closest to the infinitive, and that we have to take out. Tú is in the boot, so we take out this E and we're going to add an I. So when we rewrite the root, we're going to rewrite it like that. And then we're going to add the ending that's for this IR verb, which is es. So tú repites todo lo que, oh, we got another one over here. I'm going to take off the IR. And this is also a stem changer. It falls within that stem changing because it's a third person singular. So we're going to take out that E, add an I, and we're going to rewrite the root like that, and add the appropriate ending. Tú repites todo lo que el profesor dice. Ajá. Ok. Nosotros perder el partido de fútbol, o nosotros outside of the boot. So we can write the root exactly as it is and just add the ending. Nosotros perdemos el partido de fútbol. ¿Sí? Ellos almorzar a las 12 del día. Okay, we're going to take off the AR. Remember, it's always the one closest to the root. So this O comes out and we're going to add a UE. And it's inside the boot, right? So we're going to add that whenever we rewrite the ending. Oh, that did not look like an A. A. Okay? And then we're going to add the appropriate ending for an AR. Ellos almuerzan. Now the thing that people ask me the most often is, Miss Macbeth, this is so complicated. How do I get it? And the key is practice, 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 practice. I know that's not what you want to hear, but in a situation like this, memorization and practice is the only way forward, because to a certain extent, right, you just have to start to kind of automize that process, okay? Think of yourself like a computer. You just got to keep doing that input, so that the computer can begin to add that into its processing system and start the output process, okay? So it's very important. You just have to practice, 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 memorize, 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 okay? That is our help for this week, which is week 12, and I will see y'all guys in week 13. Hasta la semana 13. Hasta la semana que viene.